Release my father, and I'll help you walk again." The entire courtroom burst into laughter before anyone realized the little girl wasn't joking. Daniel Parker stood at the defense table in a wrinkled gray suit that hadn't fit him properly since the night he was arrested, his wrists resting calmly against the polished oak as if surrendering to the weight of a system that had already decided who he was. He had once been the kind of man strangers trusted instinctively, a volunteer firefighter who ran toward smoke when others ran away. A Little League assistant coach who kept orange slices in a cooler during July heat that climbed past 90 degrees. But today, he looked smaller, diminished beneath the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The American flag behind the bench hung perfectly still, its fabric unmoved by the heavy air of judgment that filled the room. In the front row, 7-year-old Lily Parker sat with her feet dangling inches above the floor. White sneakers scuffed at the toes, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were waiting for Sunday service to begin instead of her father's sentencing. She did not cry. She did not fidget. She watched. Across the room, Assistant District Attorney Carla Benson organized her files with crisp, efficient movements, confident in the narrative she had built, while defense attorney Ethan Cole adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes, knowing confidence and truth were not always the same thing. And presiding over it all was Judge Raymond Whitmore, stern, silver-haired, seated in a black leather wheelchair behind the high bench, a man known throughout the county for sentences as firm as concrete. 3 years earlier, a highway accident had taken the strength from his legs. Since then, he trusted evidence, procedure, and nothing else, especially not hope. The charges against Daniel Parker had sounded simple when the prosecutor read them aloud, but nothing about the past 6 months had been simple. The accusation began on a cold October evening outside a downtown office building, where a well-known real estate developer claimed Daniel had confronted him after a heated dispute over a rejected safety inspection report. According to the official statement, harsh words were exchanged and the situation escalated, yet no clear footage ever surfaced from the security cameras mounted above the entrance. The recording from that specific hour had been labeled corrupted. Daniel insisted he had been there only to submit documentation, proving that the building's fire exits did not meet code documentation he had spent weeks preparing after long shifts at the station. He said he had left before anything unusual happened. No prior complaints, no history of misconduct. Just a gap in video evidence and a testimony from a man with influence. In the weeks that followed, Daniel lost his position at the fire department, pending investigation. Headlines described him as unstable, as though years of community service could be erased by a single allegation. Lily had overheard whispers at school. She heard other parents say the word dangerous. She asked her father what it meant. He told her it meant someone had made a mistake. Now, inside the courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish, the mistake felt permanent. Ethan Cole shuffled through printed emails that suggested inconsistencies in the timeline, hoping the judge would notice the cracks. Across the aisle, Carla Benson stood steady, confident that credibility would outweigh doubt. And above them all, Judge Whitmore watched with eyes that measured facts like inches on a ruler, precise and unmoved, determined to follow the law wherever it led. Judge Raymond Whitmore had built a reputation over 3 decades on the bench by believing that emotions clouded judgment and that sympathy belonged outside the courtroom doors. 3 years earlier, on a rain-soaked stretch of interstate just 40 miles outside the city, a multi-vehicle collision had changed the mechanics of his life. Doctors had explained the spinal damage in careful clinical language using charts and percentages, speaking of therapy and limited probability. He had listened without flinching. Since that day, he measured progress in inches rather than miles in physical therapy sessions, scheduled at 6 o'clock every morning in the controlled discipline of routine. He did not indulge in what he called wishful thinking. Inside his chambers, framed commendations lined the wall, reminders that fairness required distance. Now he sat elevated behind the bench, hands resting firmly on the armrests of his wheelchair, observing the attorneys with a gaze that missed very little. He noticed the slight tremor in Ethan Cole's fingers as he organized exhibits. He noticed the steady cadence of Carla Benson's voice as she summarized the alleged timeline. He also noticed the child in the front row who had not looked away from him once. Lily Parker's expression was not defiant. It was searching, as if she were studying him the way children study storm clouds before deciding whether to run inside. The courtroom clock ticked above the door, each second landing with quiet authority. Sentencing arguments were nearing their conclusion. Outside traffic moved along Main Street, under a pale afternoon sky, ordinary life continuing in predictable patterns. Inside, however, the air felt heavier, as though something unseen hovered between the bench and the front row, waiting for a moment that no statute book could anticipate. The final arguments settled over the courtroom like dust in late afternoon light, slow and unavoidable. Ethan Cole stepped forward, clearing his throat, his voice steady but threaded with urgency, as he reminded the court that no direct evidence placed Daniel Parker at the center of any wrongdoing. He spoke of missing footage, of unanswered questions, of a man who had served his community for more than a decade without a single disciplinary mark. He spoke of reasonable doubt not as a loophole, but as a cornerstone of American justice. Daniel stood beside him, shoulders squared, eyes fixed somewhere just above the judge's bench, as if staring at a horizon only he could see. In the gallery, Lily shifted slightly in her seat for the first time all afternoon, her small fingers tightening around the fabric of her cardigan. Across the aisle, Carla Benson responded with practiced confidence, emphasizing consistency in testimony and the responsibility of the court to protect public trust. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her certainty carried weight. Judge Whitmore listened without interruption, his expression carved from restraint. When both attorneys finished, the room grew still in that particular way courtrooms do before a ruling, when even the air seems to wait for permission to move. The clock ticked above the door. A bailiff adjusted his stance near the wall. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, yet heavy with everything at stake. Judge Whitmore folded his hands, preparing to speak, to deliver words that would shape the next several years of a man's life in measured sentences and legal language. In the front row, Lily looked from her father to the bench, her gaze steady, her back straight. There was no fear in her eyes now. Only resolve, quiet and unwavering, as though she had already decided that silence was no longer an option. Judge Raymond Whitmore began to speak, his voice low and deliberate, each word measured, as though weighed on an invisible scale. He reviewed the testimony, the documented timeline, the arguments presented by both sides. Legal language filled the room, steady and controlled, outlining responsibility, credibility, and consequence. Daniel Parker listened without moving his jaw, set his eyes no longer searching the horizon, but resting briefly on his daughter, as if memorizing her face under the fluorescent lights. Lily felt the shift in the room before anyone else did. The tone had changed. The direction was clear. She slid from her seat quietly, her white sneakers touching the polished floor with a soft squeak that seemed louder than it should have been. Ethan Cole noticed her movement first, his hand instinctively reaching back, as if to guide her to stay seated, but she stepped past him with surprising calm. The bailiff straightened, uncertain, but not yet intervening. Lily walked down the narrow aisle, each step small, but certain, closing the distance between the front row and the towering bench that had always felt miles away. Judge Whitmore paused mid-sentence, his eyes lowering from the papers in front of him to the small figure now standing at the base of the bench. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Carla Benson frowned slightly, unsure whether to object or wait. Daniel whispered his daughter's name under his breath, not as a warning, but as a plea for her to be careful. Lily lifted her chin, looking directly at the judge, not at his robe, not at the emblem on the wall behind him, but at his face. There was no tremor in her voice when she asked if she could say something. The request was simple. The timing was not. Silence answered first, stretching across the room like a held breath that no one dared release. Judge Raymond Whitmore studied the child for several long seconds, his fingers resting lightly against the wooden edge of the bench. Courtrooms operated on order, on procedure, on adults speaking in measured turns, not on the spontaneous courage of a 7-year-old. Yet there was something in Lily Parker's expression that did not resemble disruption. It resembled conviction. The judge gave a slight nod to the bailiff, signaling that she could speak. A faint murmur rippled through the gallery before fading into stillness again. Lily stepped a little closer, close enough that she no longer had to raise her voice to be heard. She did not look at the attorneys. She did not look at the audience. She looked only at the man in the wheelchair. She spoke about her father waking up at 5:30 every morning to make her pancakes before school, about how he checked the smoke detectors in their small house every month, without being asked, about how he once drove 20 miles in a snowstorm just to help a neighbor whose heater had stopped working. Her words were simple, not rehearsed, free of legal strategy. She said her father always told her that helping people was the right thing to do even when it was hard. Then her tone shifted, not louder but steadier. She said she knew the judge could not walk because she had seen the chair, and she knew people sometimes stopped believing in things when they had been hurt. She said she believed her father was a good man. And then she made her promise calm and unwavering, as though stating a fact instead of proposing the impossible. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a few scattered chuckles rose from the back of the room, followed by more, the sound swelling as disbelief turned into open laughter. Even one of the clerks lowered her head to hide a smile. The echo bounced against the high ceiling. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, not from anger, but from helplessness. Ethan Cole closed his eyes briefly. Carla Benson shook her head in quiet disbelief. Judge Whitmore did not laugh, but his jaw tightened, the weight of decorum pressing against a moment that threatened to unravel it. The laughter did not fade immediately. It rolled across the courtroom in uneven waves, some sharp, some restrained, until it settled into a low hum of disbelief. Lily remained where she stood. Her small shoulders squared, her eyes fixed on Judge Raymond Whitmore, as if the reaction around her had nothing to do with her at all. Daniel felt the sound like a weight pressing against his chest, heavier than any accusation read aloud that afternoon. He opened his mouth as if to call her back, then stopped, sensing that pulling her away would only make her smaller in a room that already towered over her. Ethan Cole stepped forward, slightly ready to apologize on her behalf, but something in the judge's expression made him hesitate. Judge Whitmore lifted the gavel and brought it down once, not hard, but firm enough to cut through the noise. Order returned in fragments. A few lingering chuckles dissolved into uncomfortable silence. The judge's voice, when it came, carried no humor. He reminded the courtroom that it was not a theater. He reminded them that respect for the process mattered. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes drifted back to Lily. She did not look embarrassed. She did not retreat. Instead, she took one small step closer to the bench, closing the remaining distance until she stood just a few feet from the wheels of his chair. The bailiff shifted again, uncertain whether to intervene, but Judge Whitmore gave no signal. The fluorescent lights overhead cast pale reflections on the polished floor between them. Carla Benson folded her arms, her patience thinning, while several spectators leaned forward in their seats, curiosity replacing amusement. Lily drew in a quiet breath, as if gathering courage not from the room, but from somewhere steady inside herself. Without asking again for permission, she lifted her hand slowly, her fingers hovering in the air between childhood belief and adult skepticism, and reached toward the place everyone assumed could no longer feel anything at all. For a long moment, the courtroom was frozen. The hand hovering just above Judge Whitmore's leg seemed to stretch time itself. A silence thick and pressing clung to the room as every eye watched, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The judge did not move. He did not even blink. Lily's small hand hung there inches away from his leg, and the stillness became something heavier than expectation. It felt like the air had changed, as if the very atmosphere had altered its weight, its composition, in response to the unspoken connection forming in that fleeting space. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Lily's fingers began to lower, not in a dramatic gesture, but with the calm certainty of someone doing what they knew was right, no matter how impossible it seemed. As her fingers brushed the fabric of his trousers, something happened. It was barely noticeable at first. A faint tremor, an unsteady shiver moved through Judge Whitmore's leg. It started at the top of his thigh and trickled down as if the warmth of her touch had ignited a spark where there had been only cold. His breath caught in his chest, and for the briefest instant he thought he had imagined it, some reflex from his body, something he could explain away. But then the sensation grew stronger, as though the movement of her fingers had stirred a current deep within him, something that had been still for so long. His foot shifted slightly, the first real movement he had felt in years. The judge's face, always so impassive, twitched, a flicker of confusion crossing his features, followed by an expression of disbelief. Around the room, no one dared to speak. The murmurs of disbelief from earlier had vanished. Even the most seasoned courtroom observers who had witnessed countless moments of tension were now staring in stunned silence. Lily remained still, her hand resting lightly against him, a simple gesture of hope that had no reason to work except somehow it did. For a moment, nothing happened. The courtroom was held in a silence so dense it almost felt like a physical thing pressing against the walls. Lily's hand remained on the judge's leg, her fingers light, barely a touch, yet the energy in the room had shifted. It was as though the very air itself had been altered by the simple, unassuming act. The judge's breath had caught in his chest, his back stiffening in a way that suggested he was trying to remember how it felt to be fully alive. The tremor he had felt just moments ago had not faded. It grew. Slowly, cautiously, Judge Whitmore's foot shifted again. His toes curled. A subtle movement, but it was there. In the gallery, the spectators who had once been so quick to laugh at Lily's boldness now watched in stunned disbelief. A few leaned forward, trying to comprehend what was happening. Carla Benson's mouth had gone dry. She glanced between the judge and the child, her professional mask slipping, her mind racing to find an explanation. Ethan Cole stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, as if waiting for the ground beneath him to either crack open or somehow right itself. The room was suffocating with the weight of uncertainty. Judge Whitmore's eyes flickered back to Lily, and for the first time that day they softened, losing their sharp, calculating edge. He tried to move his legs again, and this time something more than a tremor passed through him. His foot pressed firmly against the floor. The room collectively inhaled a unified breath, held in unison before it was released, filled with the weight of a collective shock. Was it real? Was it possible? For years he had been told that the nerve damage was irreversible, that this part of his body was gone. But as Lily's hand remained there, the sensation of warmth of movement began to spread through him deeper than before. Judge Whitmore closed his eyes for a moment, as though listening to his body, something he had long stopped doing. His heart raced, but his mind, for the first time in years, felt quiet. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it. The judge didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do. He had lived his life on logic, on clear rules and expectations, but what he was feeling now could not be explained by any law he had ever studied. He shifted in his chair, slowly, deliberately feeling the muscles in his legs, the ones he thought were gone, twitching. The sensation was foreign, yet undeniable. A spark, something he had long believed had been extinguished, now flared up, pushing against the walls of his doubt. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for him to respond. The sound of his movement, barely a whisper of motion, was enough to draw the attention of everyone present. And then, when the moment stretched too long, when the room could no longer bear the weight of uncertainty, Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply. His eyes opened, meeting Lily's gaze directly for the first time. Her expression had not changed. She still stood with the same quiet confidence, her hand still resting on his leg. She did not smile, nor did she look away. There was only the certainty of someone who knew that what she had done, what she had promised, had been right. The judge cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion that he hadn't expected to feel. He stopped. Words, it seemed, failed him. He had nothing to say. The impossible had become real. There was only one thing left to do. The sound in the courtroom was almost imperceptible, like the last notes of a song fading into silence. All eyes were locked on Judge Whitmore as he sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on Lily, whose hand remained on his leg, unwavering like a quiet promise in a room filled with uncertainty. It was impossible to deny the shift that had taken place. Something had changed. The impossible had become real. For a moment, the judge simply stared at her, his mind racing, his thoughts colliding with the reality he could not fully grasp. He had been the one who had sentenced people, who had passed judgment on lives, on destinies, but here he was, on the other side of the very thing he had always believed in: justice. Was it possible that this little girl with no power, no authority, had just offered him something he had never thought he would receive again? Hope, belief, movement. Judge Whitmore exhaled, his chest tight, and then slowly, carefully, he moved again. This time it wasn't a tremor. This time he moved with purpose. His foot lifted slightly, and then again, just a little higher. It wasn't much, but it was something that hadn't been there before. It was as if the years of numbness had been gently pushed aside, just enough for him to feel the sensation again. His heart beat faster, not with panic, but with something else, something that felt like the first stirrings of life after a long, long winter. Slowly, so slowly, he raised his other foot, testing the limits of what he thought was possible. His legs trembled beneath him, but they moved. They moved. The courtroom held its breath, no one daring to speak, no one daring to move. Carla Benson's face had gone pale, her professional composure slipping for the first time. Ethan Cole's eyes widened as he watched the impossible unfold before him, as if the boundaries of reality had shifted. The room felt like it was holding its collective breath, caught between disbelief and wonder. Finally, Judge Whitmore turned his gaze back to Lily. Her hand had not wavered, not for a moment. Her eyes, so full of quiet strength, met his, and in that look, something passed between them, something deeper than words could ever express. The judge's voice, when it finally came, was rough, thick with emotion. He stopped. The words were there, but they couldn't form. There was no explanation, no reasoning that could explain what had just happened. He had always believed in logic, in the concrete laws of the world, but now he was faced with something that could not be explained, something that transcended reason. "I don't know how to explain this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. He looked down at his legs, the legs that had been still for so long, and then back at Lily, who still stood there, her hand resting on his leg. "But you," he swallowed hard, "you've given me something I thought I'd lost." His words hung in the air, as the entire room, the entire world seemed to pause and listen. No one moved, no one spoke. The impossible had become real, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The judge's words hung in the air, a fragile, almost sacred thing, drifting slowly through the room like smoke from a candle. Lily's hand still rested on his leg, steady, unmoving, as though anchoring him to this new, unexplainable reality. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She only stood there, her tiny fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of his suit, and in the silence that followed it, felt as though the world was holding its breath. Slowly, carefully, Judge Whitmore shifted his weight again, testing the limits of what he could do. This time the movement was more definite, more certain. His left leg shifted, then the right, each movement small but deliberate. There was a crackling sound inside him, something like the sound of old gears shifting in a machine that had long since stopped running. But it was working. It was happening. He could feel it with each subtle motion, each tremor that started to fade away. The room, still and tense, seemed to lean in closer to him, waiting for him to make the next move. And then, without warning, he lifted both feet off the ground just a few inches, but enough to feel the pressure against the soles of his shoes. It was a simple movement, something anyone else might take for granted, but to him it was everything. The impossible had become possible. His heart raced, and for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear or anxiety, it was from something else. Something unfamiliar yet familiar, something that felt like hope. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white, but it didn't matter. His legs were moving, and they were his again. The courtroom held its breath once more, and for the first time the silence wasn't suffocating. It was liberating. The judge, his mind still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, looked down at his legs. He could feel them. He could feel the muscles in his calves tightening, the tendons stretching as though they were waking up from a long sleep. The sensation was strange but not painful. In fact, it was exhilarating. He looked up at Lily, who had not once moved her hand, not once broken her gaze. She was still there. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite define, something beyond hope, beyond belief. How he whispered the question, barely escaping his lips. He couldn't find the words to ask what he truly wanted to know, but somehow Lily seemed to understand. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. There was nothing more to say. The courtroom remained in stunned silence, each person holding their breath, as if the moment itself might slip away if they moved too quickly. But it didn't slip away. It stayed there, rooted in the stillness, in the warmth of a touch that had started something that no one could explain. And for the first time in a long time, the judge felt something he had long ago given up on. He felt alive. He felt whole. For a long moment, the courtroom remained silent. The air was thick with disbelief, every person in the room frozen in place, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Judge Whitmore's gaze never left Lily's face. Her hand was still resting lightly on his leg, a quiet connection between them that transcended logic beyond the boundaries of reason. He had always believed in facts, in evidence, in what could be seen and measured, but now he was faced with something far beyond what he could explain. He felt the warmth of her hand, the gentle pressure against his leg, and something inside him stirred something that had been dormant for years. The sensation spread through him, growing stronger until it was impossible to ignore. He shifted again, cautiously testing his legs, and this time the movement came more easily. His right foot lifted off the floor just a fraction, but it was enough. Enough to feel. Enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, something had changed. His left foot followed suit, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, both of his feet were lifted off the ground, hovering just above the floor. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't perfect. But it was movement. It was life. The judge could hardly believe what was happening, but it was real. He could feel the blood pumping through his legs, the muscles working, stretching, waking up from a long slumber. His heart raced with a mixture of confusion and wonder, the reality of it all still too much to comprehend. But there was no denying it. He was moving. He was standing. Slowly, very slowly, he allowed himself to rise, to push against the chair, with his hands to feel the support of his legs as they bore his weight. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without pain, but it was there. He was standing. The room seemed to be holding its collective breath, every eye in the courtroom trained on the judge, watching as he fought to keep his balance, to remain upright. He could hear the faint sound of his own breath, slow and steady, as if his body was waking up after a long, difficult sleep. And then finally, the room exhaled together. The tension that had gripped the air for what seemed like an eternity dissipated. It was as though the impossible had become real, and now everyone in that room could feel the weight of what had just happened. Judge Whitmore looked down at his legs, disbelief still etched across his face, and then back at Lily. She was still standing there, her hand resting lightly on him, her gaze calm and steady. There was no arrogance in her expression, no pride, only a quiet certainty. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply believed. And in that moment, that belief had made all the difference. "You?" The judge whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done it." He could hardly believe the words himself, but they were true. She had done it. With nothing more than her belief, her quiet strength, and the touch of her hand, she had given him something he never thought he would have again. Hope. The impossible had become possible. And for the first time in years, Judge Whitmore felt truly alive. The moment lingered, stretched thin, like the last note of a song slowly fading into the silence. Judge Whitmore stood there, his legs unsteady beneath him, the feeling in his limbs both foreign and familiar. For years, his life had been a series of controlled movements dictated by a wheelchair, by the constraints of his body that had betrayed him in an instant. But now something different was happening, something he couldn't explain. His legs, once still and lifeless, now responded to the slightest pressure, the smallest push. He felt the weight of his own body in a way he hadn't in years. His foot shifted, testing the floor, and for a brief moment, it was as if time itself paused. The courtroom was as still as the air before a storm, each person holding their breath, unsure whether to believe what they were seeing. Daniel Parker stood in the front row, his hands trembling at his sides. His eyes were locked on the judge, watching him with a mixture of disbelief and awe. He had come to this place hoping for justice, hoping for his name to be cleared. But what he was witnessing now was something far beyond that. This was not just a court case. This was something more. The impossible was unfolding before him, and he didn't know how to process it. Lily, standing beside him, had not moved. She didn't need to. She had done what she had come here to do. She had promised. And now she was watching as the reality of her promise took shape. The judge lifted one foot, then the other, and the movement, slow and hesitant, was more than anyone had dared to expect. His face, usually stern and unreadable, now betrayed a hint of something raw, something human. There was confusion, yes, but there was also wonder. There was fear, but there was also a strange kind of hope. The judge had lived his life by the book. He had lived by the law, by procedure, by what could be proven and measured. But in this moment, in this small, quiet space between disbelief and reality, he was forced to confront something he had never accounted for belief. And it wasn't just Lily's belief. It was his own. He believed in something now, something that transcended the rigid structure he had spent his life constructing. He could feel it in his legs, in his chest, in the very air around him. It was a surge of life, a surge of something he had forgotten existed. He looked down at his feet, now planted firmly on the ground. He was standing. Not perfectly, not without effort, but he was standing. And for the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a flicker of the man he had once been. He didn't know how long he stood there, caught between disbelief and reality, but eventually his gaze lifted. He looked at Lily, standing so still, so sure. There were no words left. He had nothing to say that could encapsulate what had just happened. He had no explanation. But in his heart, in the deep, quiet place that had remained hidden for so long, he knew one thing: something had changed. And it was more than just his body. It was his world. It was his understanding of what was possible. And in that moment, as the judge stood before the courtroom, every person present felt it too. The impossible had happened, and nothing would ever be the same. Judge Whitmore stood motionless for a long moment, his hands gripping the sides of his wheelchair, as if the simple act of remaining upright required all of his concentration. His legs, once still and unresponsive, now felt like they belonged to him again. The tremor in his limbs had faded, replaced by a steady, powerful sense of control that was almost overwhelming. It wasn't just that he was standing, it was that he was standing without the pain that had been his constant companion for years. His breath caught in his throat, the realization of what was happening washing over him like a tidal wave. The courtroom, which had been filled with stunned silence, now felt charged with a strange, palpable energy. Every person present knew that something extraordinary had just occurred. Even the smallest shift in the room felt monumental. Ethan Cole, who had been standing silently beside Daniel, glanced between the judge and Lily, his brow furrowed in confusion. His mind raced, struggling to process the impossible sight in front of him. Carla Benson? Her professional composure wavering, watched with an expression that seemed torn between disbelief and something deeper, something that could almost be described as awe. Daniel, his heart still hammering in his chest, could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had come to this courtroom expecting a battle for his freedom, a fight for his name. But this was something beyond the realm of logic, beyond anything he could have ever anticipated. And Lily, his daughter, stood there, unwavering, her small hand still gently resting on the judge's leg, the very hand that had made this moment possible. She had given him her belief, her faith, and in return, the impossible had become real. As Judge Whitmore took another tentative step, the sound of his feet shifting against the floor broke the silence in the room, a sound that seemed to echo far louder than it actually was. The judge's face was a mixture of wonder and disbelief, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for some explanation for the miracle that had just unfolded. He didn't speak for a moment. He simply breathed, feeling the sensation of movement in his legs, the muscles that had been frozen in time now responding to his will. For the first time in years, he was in control. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, a little strained, as if he was still trying to make sense of what had happened. He began, then stopped as though the words were foreign to him. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the lump in his throat. "I don't know what to say." He continued, his voice quieter now, filled with the weight of the moment. "I don't know how this happened." His gaze turned to Lily, whose face remained calm and steady, as if she had known all along that this was possible. There was no pride in her eyes, no sense of triumph. She simply stood there watching him, her hand still resting on his leg, the quiet connection between them unbroken. The judge swallowed again, his mind spinning with questions, with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "But I do know this," he said, his voice steadier, now filled with a quiet conviction. "You've given me something I thought I lost forever. Something I never thought I would feel again." The room was still, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Lily's simple act of faith had not only changed his body, it had changed his world. And for the first time in a long time, Judge Whitmore felt something stir inside him. Something that had been buried beneath years of duty, of responsibility, of cold, detached professionalism. He felt alive. He felt human. And for the first time in what seemed like forever, he smiled genuinely, without reservation, as he looked at Lily, the little girl who had given him back what he had lost. The courtroom remained silent, every eye fixed on Judge Whitmore as he stood unsteady, but determined, his legs beneath him once more moving with a newfound purpose. The tension in the room was palpable, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the impossible. Daniel Parker's heart raced in his chest, his hands trembling at his sides. He had come here to defend his freedom, but now he was witnessing something far more extraordinary. This was not just a victory in court. This was a victory of faith, of belief in something beyond the tangible. The judge, a man known for his unwavering adherence to the law, was now standing, moving in a way he had not in years. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles white, as he took another step forward, testing the ground beneath him. The movement was slow, hesitant, but it was real. His body, once constrained by the limits of injury, was responding to a force he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the physical act of standing. It was the emotional weight that came with it, the years of feeling trapped in a body that had betrayed him, now slowly being undone. For a long moment, Judge Whitmore didn't speak. He didn't need to. His body was speaking for him, each movement a testament to the power of the human spirit. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes, and in that shared moment of silence, something passed between them. A recognition. A shared understanding that what had just happened defied explanation, defied logic. The judge turned his attention to Lily, who still stood beside her father, her small hand resting gently on his leg. She had given him something that no one else could. She had given him hope. A hope that, despite the years of doubt, of pain, was now making itself known. Her eyes, calm and steady, never left his. She hadn't asked for anything in return. She had simply believed, and that belief had changed everything. The judge swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, but it carried a depth of feeling that surprised him. "I don't know how this happened," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know it's real." He took another cautious step, testing the strength in his legs, and for the first time in years, he felt something that had been lost for so long. Freedom. Freedom to move, to stand, to live. It was more than just a physical change. It was a transformation of his very spirit. He looked at Lily again, his eyes filled with gratitude, with awe. "You've done more than you'll ever know," he said softly. Lily didn't smile. She didn't need to. There was no need for words between them now. The connection was clear. The impossible had become real. And in that moment, Judge Whitmore realized that what had just happened wasn't just a miracle. It was a reminder of the power of belief, of the strength that lies in something greater than the rules of law, something greater than logic. It was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when we least expect them. And as he stood there, no longer a man trapped by his body, but a man free once more, he understood that the world was a much larger place than the one he had spent years in. He had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at hope. And in that, there was more power than any court decision could ever offer. The following days felt like a strange, slow-motion dream for Daniel Parker. After the courtroom had erupted in disbelief and wonder, the world outside seemed to move faster than ever yet. Daniel couldn't escape the stillness that had settled over him. His father, the man who had always been his pillar of strength, had stood in front of everyone, and with a simple act of belief had been transformed. It wasn't just that the judge had walked again, no, it was the feeling that lingered long after the moment had passed. It was the way his father had looked at him, after it all happened, the way his eyes seemed to say everything that words could not. Lily had been the catalyst, the quiet spark that ignited the fire of change, and Daniel found himself overwhelmed with emotions he didn't know how to express. But it wasn't just about his father. It was about the ripple effect that had begun in that courtroom, spreading outward into the world. Lily's promise had done something more than heal a broken man. It had awakened something deep inside all of them. For the first time, Daniel felt a quiet hope rising inside him. He had lived for so long under the shadow of doubt, both in his innocence and in the possibility that his life might never be the same again. Now, for the first time, he believed not just in the court's justice, but in the unseen forces that had brought them here. He looked over at Lily, his little girl who sat quietly in the corner of their small living room drawing. She was just a child, but there was a wisdom in her that went beyond her years, a strength that made Daniel proud in ways he couldn't fully explain. She had seen things others could not believed in, what was impossible, and it had changed the course of their lives forever. As he watched her draw, his thoughts drifted back to the judge, the man who had once been so rigid, so focused on the law and the cold certainty of his rulings. But now, after what had happened in that courtroom, it was clear that something had changed within him as well. There was a new light in Judge Whitmore's eyes, a new understanding, something deeper than the law itself. And that gave Daniel hope. He realized that sometimes justice wasn't just about what could be proven in a courtroom. Sometimes it was about belief. And Lily, with her quiet conviction, had given everyone around her something they hadn't known they were missing. As the days passed, the weight of what had happened started to sink in. The media, who had once been quick to paint Daniel as a villain, now shifted their attention. The story of the judge who had regained the ability to walk, of the little girl who had healed him with nothing more than her touch, and her words spread like wildfire. People began to talk, not just about the case, but about the power of faith, about the mysteries of the human spirit. And in a way, Daniel felt as though they had all been given a second chance. A second chance to believe not just in the law or in themselves, but in something greater, something that could not be measured, but could only be felt. The days went by slowly, but each one carried with it the promise of something new, something brighter, something filled with hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of media interviews, public attention, and quiet reflection. Daniel Parker found himself navigating the world in a way he never thought possible. What had started as a courtroom battle to clear his name had transformed into something bigger, something far beyond the reach of simple legal proceedings. The story of Lily's promise and the miracle that followed had captivated the nation, and it seemed that every newspaper, every news station was eager to tell it. People spoke of the impossible of a man who had been freed not just from the chains of a false accusation, but from the prison of his own body. And through it all, Lily remained the same. She had not changed. She still woke up every morning with a quiet confidence, drawing, playing, living the life of a child, even though she now knew that her simple belief had altered the course of history. Daniel, on the other hand, was learning what it meant to live in the light of something so extraordinary. The weight of the media attention was both a gift and a burden. He knew that the world had witnessed something miraculous, but he also knew that the truth of what had happened was far more personal than anyone could understand. It wasn't just about his father's miraculous recovery. It was about the bond that had formed between them, the unspoken promise that had been made between a father and a daughter, and the realization that the world was not as rigid as it seemed. The world he now understood was full of possibilities, unseen forces, unmeasurable moments that could shape lives in ways that were beyond explanation. Judge Whitmore, too, had been changed. His life, once defined by his wheelchair, was now filled with new possibilities. His recovery was not just physical, it was spiritual. He had come to understand that the law he had once believed in so strongly was not the only thing that governed the world. There were forces at work that could not be explained, forces that connected people in ways that transcended logic. And so the courtroom drama had become something of a legend, a story that people would tell for years to come. But to Daniel, it was much more than that. It was a reminder of the power of belief, of how faith, no matter how small, could change the world. He watched his father now, not as a man trapped in a chair, but as someone with the freedom to walk, to move, to live a life he had once thought was lost to him. And as for Lily, her quiet, steadfast belief had done more than anyone could have ever expected. She had given them all a gift of hope, a gift of change. And with each passing day, as the world continued to turn, Daniel found himself more and more grateful for the miracle that had touched their lives, and he knew deep in his heart that nothing at all would ever be the same. As the days passed, the world outside began to return to its usual rhythm, but inside Daniel Parker's life, everything had changed. The impossible had unfolded right before his eyes, and now he walked through the world with a sense of wonder he had never known before. The weight of his past was still with him, but it felt lighter now, as if the burden of doubt had been lifted, replaced by something he couldn't quite define. He would often find himself looking at Lily, marveling at how one simple act of faith had turned everything around. She was still the same girl, the one who had always drawn with bright colors and filled their home with laughter. But now there was something different about her, something that made her seem older, wiser than her 7 years should have allowed. She had given him hope when he thought it was gone, and in doing so she had not only changed his world, but also the judge's world, the man who had once been cold, rigid, and removed from emotion. Judge Whitmore had become a symbol of transformation, not just for Daniel and Lily, but for everyone who heard their story. The media had followed their journey, but for Daniel, the story was more than just headlines and interviews. It was about the deep, unspoken bond that had been forged in that courtroom between father-daughter and the judge who had been given the chance to walk again. Every day as Daniel and Lily spent time together, they spoke little of the miracle that had happened. It wasn't because they had forgotten it, but because it had become part of their lives woven into the fabric of who they were now. They didn't need to talk about it. The miracle wasn't just in what had happened in the courtroom. It was in the way Daniel looked at life now, with a renewed sense of purpose and belief. He had always known that life was fragile, that it could change in an instant, but he had never truly understood how powerful belief could be. As for Judge Whitmore, he too had found a new path. No longer confined to his wheelchair, he had regained not just his ability to walk, but a newfound understanding of the human spirit. He had been a man of the law, but now he saw that there was more to life than just following the rules. He often found himself thinking of Lily, of the quiet girl who had given him back the one thing he thought was lost forever, his ability to hope. The judge, once stoic and unemotional, had learned to embrace the unpredictability of life. He had learned that some things could not be measured or understood, that sometimes the heart led where reason could not. And in that realization, he found peace. The world outside had returned to normal, but for Daniel, Lily, and Judge Whitmore, nothing would ever be the same. They had been touched by something greater than themselves, and it had changed them in ways they couldn't have imagined. It was a reminder that sometimes the impossible could happen, and all it took was belief. For Daniel, every day now felt like a gift. Every moment with Lily felt precious. The miracle had not just been in the courtroom, it had been in the quiet moments, the unspoken promises, and the unwavering belief that had carried them all through the storm. They had all been given a second chance, not just at life, but at the possibility of a future filled with hope. And that was something no one could ever take away. It had been several weeks since the courtroom miracle, but for Daniel and Lily, it felt like the world had changed forever. The echo of that day still lingered in the air, filling their home with a quiet, steady warmth. Daniel had always believed in hard work, in doing what was right, but now he understood something deeper. Life wasn't just about following the rules or playing by the book. Sometimes it was about having faith, about trusting in things unseen and letting go of the fear that kept him bound to the past. Lily had taught him that. She had shown him that the power of belief, even the smallest spark of hope, could change everything. He watched her now, as she sat by the window sketching quietly, the sunlight casting a gentle glow on her face. She was still the same girl with her infectious smile and boundless curiosity. But now there was something about her that seemed to shine even brighter, as if the belief she had in herself, in her father, and in the world had filled her up completely. And in that light, Daniel felt something shift within him. The judge's life had also changed. Judge Whitmore, the man who had once been a symbol of cold logic and strict rules, now moved through the world with a new understanding. He had walked away from that courtroom a different man, one who no longer viewed life through the narrow lens of what was measurable. He had felt the warmth of Lily's hand, the touch that had healed him, and it had opened his eyes to the truth. Sometimes the heart leads the way, and the impossible becomes possible when you least expect it. Daniel knew, as he looked at his daughter and thought about the changes in the judge, that the world was full of miracles. They weren't always dramatic or grand. Sometimes they were simple moments, like a child's belief in something greater that could transform everything. And he was grateful. Grateful for the new life they were building together, for the second chance they had been given, and for the unspoken promise that nothing, not even the most impossible of odds, was beyond their reach. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel Parker found himself learning how to breathe again, each inhale filling him with a new sense of possibility. The weight of the past still lingered in the corners of his mind, but it no longer held the same power over him. He had watched as his daughter Lily, with a quiet strength that only a child could possess, had given him back something he never thought he would have again: hope. Not just hope for the future, but hope for the present in every small moment that made life meaningful. He would never forget the day in the courtroom when Lily had stepped forward, her small hand resting gently on the judge's leg, offering him something that changed everything. That simple gesture had sparked a series of events that none of them could have predicted, leading them to this place where the impossible had become a reality. Lily continued to draw her imagination, as vibrant as ever. But now when Daniel looked at her, he saw not just the child he had always known, but someone far beyond her years. She had reminded him that the world wasn't just a place to survive, but a place to live in, to believe in, and to find joy in the most unexpected of moments. In the quiet of their home, they spoke less of miracles and more about the future. It wasn't that they had forgotten the extraordinary events that had brought them here, but rather that they had learned to live beyond them. The world outside may have moved on, but for Daniel and Lily, the lessons they had learned of faith, belief, and the power of human connection remained at the heart of everything they did. Judge Whitmore, too, had found peace in the wake of that miraculous moment. He had learned that sometimes the world doesn't operate according to logic or rules. Sometimes it operates according to something much more mysterious and profound: belief. He had walked away from that courtroom not just as a man healed physically, but as a man reborn in spirit. His life, once dictated by the confines of his wheelchair, was now filled with the freedom of possibility. And so the three of them, Daniel, Lily, and Judge Whitmore, carried on, forever changed by the miracle they had witnessed together, and by the simple truth that anything was possible when you believed. As time passed, the ripple of that moment in the courtroom continued to spread, though quietly now, like the gentle expansion of a wave on a calm lake. Life for Daniel, Lily, and Judge Whitmore moved forward, each of them carrying with them the weight of what had happened, but in a way that felt lighter than it once had. Daniel had never been one to dwell on the past, but now when he looked back, he saw it differently. He didn't see the years of struggle, the doubts, the failures. Instead, he saw the miracle that had set them all on this new path. A miracle not just in the physical act of healing, but in the way it had changed their hearts. He looked at Lily, his daughter, who had always been wise beyond her years, and he understood that the true miracle had been her belief. Her unwavering trust in the possibility of change had opened doors none of them had ever thought to walk through. Lily continued to draw as she always had, but there was a new light in her eyes now, a quiet understanding of the power she held within her. She had changed the world without ever asking for anything in return. As for Judge Whitmore, his life had taken on a new rhythm. The man who had once defined himself by the law now embraced the unmeasurable, the inexplicable. He had learned that not everything could be explained by rules and regulations. Some things were simply beyond the reach of logic, and that was where the real magic lay. He often found himself smiling as he thought back to the courtroom that day, when a small hand had touched his leg and changed everything. The three of them, Daniel, Lily, and Judge Whitmore, had been given something rare, something precious, a second chance at life, at hope, at possibility. And as they moved forward, they did so with the understanding that miracles were not just things of fairy tales. Sometimes they happened in the most unexpected of places, when people chose to believe even when logic said they shouldn't. For Daniel and Lily, that belief had been their anchor. For Judge Whitmore, it had been his freedom. And for all of them, it had been the beginning of a new journey, one where anything, truly anything, was possible. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.